My topic today is Greek government, the rise of democracy. Specifically, I will be talking about Athenian democracy. The etymology of democracy is that it comes from the Greek term demokratia, demos, or the people, and kratos, are force or power, or to rule. So together, these words mean rule of the people. And a specific note here is that democracy at this early of a time does not mean rule by all of the people, only rule of the people. And that is something I will discuss a little bit later on. Ancient Greece was composed of hundreds of city states, including Sparta, Athens, Corinth. There are lots of others that we've heard about. Um, from the ninth century through the 7th century and into the first few years of the 6th century BC, Athens was under the rule of an aristocracy. And an aristocracy is rule of the best, or those who think they are the best. And the aristocracy was responsible for Athens encompassing a larger land area as well as a growing population. During this time, they took over um, Attica, or the surrounding area around Athens, and other some of the other smaller areas. Um, some of the other city states that were around Athens had, or were a part of ancient Greece, had oligarchies, and others had monarchies. And a monarchy is rule of one, and an oligarchy is rule of the few. As the city state of Athens grew larger, the population started to get wary of the aristocracy, and so they began to cause social and political changes. These were allowed the beginnings of democracy to form. Around 594 BC, Solon was appointed to be an archon and eventually was granted temporary autocratic powers to deal with social unrest. Um, he was a member of the aristocracy, so they didn't feel threatened by him that he would remove all of their powers. So the reforms he set were more just to deal with the inequalities in Athens, not to actually um, make major changes that took the aristocracy, so they didn't have any power. Really, just let some other people come up through the ranks. And the reforms he performed were to the constitution, the economy, and to the moral fabric of Athenian society. Some of the reforms that he undertook were the enslavement of Athenian citizens was abolished. Prior to this, even if you were a citizen of Athens, you could become a slave of someone else due to debt or perceived wrongs. He also divided the citizens into four classes based on wealth. Thetis, which is the poorest and the majority of the population, they gained political right for the first time and were able to vote in the assembly. The changes implemented by Solon only lasted for around 20 years before social unrest enveloped Athens again. Around 541 BC, Solon's cousin Pyastratus took control of Athens by force, and he ruled until his death in 527 BC. And after his death, he was succeeded by his sons Hippias and Hipparchus. They ruled together until Hipparchus was assassinated in 514 BC, and Hippias was then overthrown in 510 BC. And he was overthrown because he had turned into a true dictator, unlike his father, who was a very popular ruler. Under his father's rule, Athens became prosperous, and and he hadn't dismantled the constitution put in place by Solon. He just made sure that his family was in a position of power. But when his children took over, they started to unravel some of that, and in the case of Hippias, he acted like a true dictator. After the overthrow of Hippias, Cleisthenes took charge, and he established what would become the first democracy in 508 or 507 BC. He is known as the father of Athenian democracy. He removed the 4 traditional tribes that were based on family relations and broke Athens into 10 tribes based on area of residence, and he also divided those in, I think there were about 140 municipalities within Athens. He established legislative bodies run by individuals chosen by lottery, and he reorganized the boule that had been created by Solon to have 50 members from each of the 10 tribes. Cleisthenes didn't refer to these reforms as democracy. Instead, he called them isonomia, which means equality vis-a-vis law. As democracy continued to form, Ephialtes was another influential politician in the democratic movement. He was active during the late 460s BC until his assassination in 461 BC. His political leadership was passed on to his deputy Pericles, and Pericles was a political leader from roughly 461 BC to 429 BC. He oversaw some of the grandest and most controversial reforms yet to this new way of rule that later became known as democracy. During his time, he implemented nascent forms of welfare for the poor. He added requirements. No, he didn't add. He removed requirements for holding a public office. The land requirement was reduced, and he limited Athenian citizenship only to those with Athenian parentage on both sides. This was the most controversial reform that he had. Just an overview of Athenian democracy. It was a direct democracy rather than the representative democracy that we have in the U.S. This means that laws and decrees were voted on directly by the people, and they were proposed by the people, not by elected officials. Citizenship was only afforded to adult males who had completed their military training. So this was about age 20. And freed slaves, children, women, and foreign nationals were not considered citizens. This means that only about 10 to 20% of the Athenian population was considered a citizen and therefore eligible to vote. They also were more likely to be involved in the process than we are now as citizens, because they were some of the more affluent individuals, so they could afford to have someone else do their work or have slaves, and then they could devote their time to going to the assembly and going to all other meetings involved. And the 3 main bodies of governance were the assembly, the boule, and the courts. A few other notes. The assembly was open to all citizens and was not an elected office. So this was anybody that's considered a citizen that was over 20 that is a male. And then the court was a subset of the assembly, and only citizens over the age of 30 were allowed to vote. Boole or council was an elected position, and it mainly involved administrative duties such as preparing measures for deliberation by the assembly. It was also responsible for executing the wishes of the assembly. So really, the Boole didn't have a lot of direct influence. However, their influence was still could be felt, because if they didn't bring something up for the assembly, then no one really did. Um, in the assembly, their main functions were executive pronouncements or decrees, such as going to war or allowing a foreign national to become a citizen. They elected some officials, and they also dealt with legislative tasks. And the court handled private and public suits, and juries were selected by a lot from a jury pool. There was no time for deliberation after both sides had spoken, and so this meant that any interaction between the jurors was during the time of voting, and they were trying to influence one another to vote on the same side they were. And all cases that were presented to the court were handled within one day. Another interesting fact about Athenian democracy is the concept of ostracism or exile. So now, if we don't like our political foes, we go to the airwaves and we try to knock them down a notch. But back in ancient Greece, they would bring them before the court or the council and to try to get them ostracized or exiled. And this didn't necessarily mean they were going to be removed from Athens. It just meant that they lost all political credibility. They weren't allowed to vote anymore. You just put them in the ranks of non-citizens. And that is all I have for today, and this is my bibliography. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know. Thanks.